The words cut through the afternoon heat like a blade drawn across silence. A girl of 18 summers stood before the war chief Inali, her bare feet planted in the dust of the Red Rock trading post, and spoke the promise that would become legend. When she grew older, she declared, she would return to claim him as her husband. The stillness that followed was absolute, a moment frozen in the merciless glare of the New Mexico sun, before Inali's laughter shattered it into fragments. The sound was deep and brutal, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder mocking the rain. His warriors joined the chorus, their voices layered with contempt for the girl who stood before them, with nothing but audacity and a silver locket clutched against her chest. Inali sat atop his charcoal stallion, a man carved from obsidian and pride, his authority stretching across the Chiricahua territories like the shadow of a great bird. He was a war chief whose name alone could turn the blood cold in the veins of settlers, a leader who had never known defeat in the complex dance of desert warfare. His chest was broad beneath the leather vest adorned with turquoise, his arms marked with the scars of 100 battles, each one a testament to his dominance. The silver bands at his wrists caught the light as he gestured dismissively at the girl, and his eyes held the hardness of a man who had looked into the face of death and forced it to blink first. He ruled his people with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been challenged by anyone who mattered, certainly not by a displaced girl whose clan had been scattered like seeds on barren ground. Kaya stood before him with a stillness that unnerved those who bothered to notice. She was small in stature, but there was something ancient in her bearing, as though she carried the weight of generations in her slender frame. Her dark hair hung past her shoulders, threaded with the red clay dust of the desert, and her gray eyes held a quality that few could name. She did not flinch when the laughter rose around her. She did not lower her gaze when Inali leaned forward in his saddle to study her, as one might study an insect of peculiar appearance. The trading post fell silent except for the creak of leather and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The white merchants watched from the shade of their awnings, understanding nothing of the language being spoken, but sensing the crackling tension in the air. The girl's lineage was known to those who remembered. Her mother had been a woman of the mountain clans, her father a warrior who had fallen in the endless skirmishes with the cavalry. She had been raised in the scattered remains of her people, moving from camp to camp like a ghost, learning survival from those who had mastered it through necessity. She possessed no wealth, no warriors to call her own, no land that could be measured in anything but memories. Yet she stood before the most powerful man in the territory and made a claim that bordered on madness. The audacity of it was almost beautiful in its impossibility. Inali's response was delivered with the casual cruelty of absolute power. His words cut through her declaration like a knife through smoke, reducing her promise to the foolish dream of a child who understood nothing of the world's true nature. He spoke of her as one might speak of a persistent coyote, annoying but ultimately harmless, something to be driven away with stones and laughter. His warriors nodded their agreement, their faces carved with amusement and scorn. They were men who had fought beside their chief through seasons of blood and fire, who had watched him negotiate treaties with white generals and break those same treaties when it served their purposes. The idea that this girl, this displaced remnant of a broken clan, could ever stand as his equal was beyond comprehension. Yet there was something in the way she absorbed the mockery that should have given them pause. Her face remained calm as the desert before a storm, her breathing steady, her hands loose at her sides. When she finally turned to leave, she did not run or hurry. She walked with measured steps through the crowd of warriors, past the trading post where merchants whispered in English and Spanish, toward the shimmering horizon where the desert met the sky. The locket at her throat caught the light once, a brief flash of silver, before she disappeared into the heat waves that rose from the baked earth. No one called after her. No one followed. She was dismissed as thoroughly as morning mist beneath the climbing sun, but Inali for just a moment felt something shift in the air around him. It was not fear, not precisely. It was the sensation a man feels when he realizes he has made an error in judgment, though the consequences remain hidden in the future's depths. He pushed the feeling aside as he wheeled his stallion toward the canyon trails. He had territories to defend, enemies to outmaneuver, a people to lead through the narrowing paths of a world that grew more hostile with each passing moon. The girl and her absurd promise faded from his thoughts like smoke dispersing in the wind. He did not know that 15 years would pass before he understood the magnitude of what he had dismissed. He did not know that the girl walking into the desert carried more than a locket. She carried the cold seed of determination that would grow in darkness and silence, feeding on every slight, every dismissal, every moment of mockery, until it became something that could reshape the very foundations of his world. The girl who vanished into the desert did not die as many assumed she would. Instead, she walked east, leaving the red canyons and endless sky for a different kind of wilderness altogether. The cities of the white men rose before her like mountains of stone and glass, their streets paved with intentions as hard as the iron rails that were slowly creeping westward. Kaya learned quickly that survival in this new world required a different kind of strength than what the desert demanded. Here, power was measured not in warriors or horses, but in the abstract language of contracts and capital, in the cold arithmetic of profit margins and property deeds. She found her first teacher in a mission school, where stern women in gray habits taught reading and arithmetic alongside prayers to a God whose love seemed conditional on obedience. Kaya absorbed everything they offered, not because she believed in their salvation, but because she understood that literacy was a weapon the white world respected. She read their newspapers and legal documents, discovering that beneath the flowery language of civilization lay the same brutal calculations she had seen in territorial disputes among the clans. The difference was only in presentation. A treaty signed in Washington carried the same weight as a war chief's declaration, and could be just as easily broken when convenience demanded it. Her second teacher was a man named Ezekiel Miller, an industrialist whose wealth had been built on the bones of men who died in silver mines and on railroads that carved through sacred lands without permission or apology. Miller was a predator who recognized a kindred spirit in the young woman who appeared at his office one winter morning. Her resume written in flawless copperplate script, her recommendations fabricated with careful attention to detail. He hired her as a clerk, then as an assistant, then as something approximating a protégé, when he realized that her mind worked with the precision of a well-oiled machine. She learned from him that sentiment was a liability, that mercy was weakness, that the world belonged to those willing to take it through whatever means necessary. Under Miller's tutelage, Kaya discovered the archives that would become her arsenal. The railroads kept meticulous records of every survey, every land grant, every negotiation with tribal leaders and territorial governments. She spent years in dusty offices, her fingers stained with ink, tracing the paper trails that revealed the fragile legal foundations beneath what seemed like immovable power. She learned that Inali's territory, the vast expanse he claimed to rule, existed in a legal gray space created by conflicting treaties and abandoned claims. The Mexican government had once owned it. The American government now claimed sovereignty. The Apache people had occupied it for generations. And somewhere in the gaps between these competing narratives, opportunities existed for someone clever enough to exploit them. The transformation was not merely intellectual. Kaya learned to navigate the social mechanisms of power with the same skills she applied to legal documents. She attended dinners where men in expensive suits discussed the futures of entire peoples as though arranging chess pieces. She learned which fork to use, which wine to order, how to modulate her voice to suggest authority without aggression. She became fluent in the performance of civilization, understanding that the white world valued appearance as much as substance. The girl who had stood barefoot in the red rock dust learned to walk in boots that cost more than a horse, to wear dresses that whispered of wealth and cultivation. But beneath the silk and careful manners, the core of her remained unchanged, hard and patient as stone shaped by centuries of wind. The silver locket never left her throat, hidden beneath high collars and pearl necklaces. It was her reminder, her anchor, the physical manifestation of a promise spoken in dust and mockery. On nights when the city's noise became unbearable, When the stone walls pressed close and the air tasted of coal smoke instead of sage, she would hold the locket and remember Inali's laughter. The memory no longer brought shame or anger. Instead, it brought clarity. She was not building her empire from revenge alone, though revenge was certainly part of the architecture. She was building it from the understanding that power was the only language the world truly spoke, and she had become fluent in dialects that Inali, for all his warrior's strength, could never master. When the drought came to the New Mexico territories, Kaya was 3,000 miles away, sitting in Miller's office overlooking the gray waters of the Atlantic. The news reached her through railroad reports and government dispatches. The Gila River was failing, they said. The Apache clans were growing desperate. Conflicts with the cavalry were escalating into massacres on both sides. She read the reports with the detachment of someone studying a weather pattern, noting details, calculating probabilities. Miller asked if she planned to return to the savage territories, his voice heavy with the casual racism that permeated every corner of his world. She told him that she did, and that when she returned, she would own more than just memories. She spent 6 months assembling the pieces, land deeds purchased from desperate settlers, water rights acquired through shell companies, debts bought from merchants who had extended credit to Inali's people during harder times, legal claims to mineral deposits that existed in disputed territories. She worked with lawyers who charged by the hour and cared nothing for justice, only for the elegant construction of unbreakable contracts. By the time she boarded the westbound train, Kaya held enough legal leverage to crush what remained of Inali's authority without ever drawing a weapon. The girl who had once owned nothing now controlled the very air he breathed, and she had learned patience enough to wait for the perfect moment to make him understand exactly how much his laughter had cost him. The carriage that rolled into the valley was black as a raven's wing, pulled by matched horses whose coats gleamed despite the dust that covered everything else. The drought had transformed the landscape into something biblical in its desolation. The Gila River, once wide enough to cool 100 horses, had shrunk to a thread of mud between cracked banks. The cottonwoods that had provided shade for generations stood skeletal against the merciless sky, their leaves long since surrendered to the relentless sun. The earth itself seemed to be dying, splitting open in wounds that revealed the pale clay beneath, and the wind that moved across the valley carried no moisture, only the fine grit of a land turning to powder. Inali's people were starving. The deer had migrated to higher elevations in search of water. The sparse crops they had managed to cultivate in better years had withered in the fields. The cavalry, led by Colonel Jedediah Blackwood, had tightened the noose around the remaining Apache territories, using the drought as an opportunity to force surrender through strategic control of the few remaining water sources. Skirmishes had become weekly occurrences, brief and brutal exchanges that left bodies on both sides and solved nothing. Inali, who had once ridden with 50 warriors at his back, now commanded perhaps 20 men fit enough to fight, and even they moved with the hollow-eyed desperation of those who knew they were fighting a battle already lost. The appearance of the black carriage caused a ripple of confusion through the camp. Merchants no longer ventured this far into disputed territory. Government representatives traveled with military escorts. But this vehicle arrived alone, moving with the confidence of absolute safety, as though its occupant existed beyond the reach of the violence that consumed everyone else. The warriors watched it approach with hands on weapons, uncertain whether this represented threat or opportunity. When the carriage door opened, a woman emerged, and the whispers began immediately. She wore black, severe and elegant, a dress that would have been appropriate in a Boston drawing room but seemed alien beneath the New Mexico sun. Her dark hair was arranged in a complex style that suggested hours of careful attention, held in place with combs of carved ivory. Gloves covered her hands despite the heat. A parasol of black lace provided shade for features that seemed familiar, in a way that nagged at memory without quite resolving into recognition. She moved across the broken ground with careful steps, her boots somehow remaining clean, despite the dust that covered everything. And when she lifted her eyes to survey the camp, those who met her gaze felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. Inali emerged from his lodge, And the recognition was not immediate. 15 years had transformed the war chief as thoroughly as they had transformed the girl. His frame, once powerful as a mountain cat, had been whittled down by hunger and endless combat. The silver at his temples had spread like frost through his dark hair. New scars marked his face and arms, some healed poorly, testaments to battles fought without adequate medicine or rest. But his eyes still held their fierce intelligence, and his bearing still commanded respect even when his physical presence had diminished. He studied the woman with the wariness of someone who had learned to trust nothing that arrived unbidden. The meeting occurred in the center of the camp, with the entire clan as witness. The woman moved with deliberate grace, stopping at a distance that suggested neither fear nor familiarity. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite its quiet register, and the language she used was the tongue of the Chiricahua, spoken with an accent that suggested long absence but perfect retention of grammar and nuance. She greeted the war chief with the formal courtesy due to a leader, acknowledging his position without the deference of a supplicant. And then, with the precision of someone placing the final piece in a complex puzzle, she reminded him of a promise made 15 years ago, of laughter that had echoed through the Red Rock trading post, of a girl who had declared she would return to claim what she had been denied. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted her original declaration. This silence was heavy with dawning recognition, with the terrible understanding of time's passage and transformation's power. Inali's warriors looked between their chief and the woman, seeing her now through the lens of memory, tracing the girl's features in the woman's face, understanding slowly what should have been obvious from the moment she arrived. This was not a merchant or government representative. This was something far more dangerous. This was the past returning to collect a debt no one had remembered existed. Kaya did not wait for Inali to find his voice. She produced documents from the leather case her driver had retrieved from the carriage, spreading them across a makeshift table with movements that suggested she had performed this ritual many times before. The papers told a story written in legal language that few present could read, but the meaning became clear as she explained with merciless precision. The land they occupied, she said, was claimed through grants issued by the Mexican government before the American acquisition. Those grants had been purchased by companies she controlled. The water rights to the remaining springs, she continued, had been secured through territorial courts that recognized property law over ancestral tradition. The debts accumulated by the clan for supplies purchased from white merchants had been consolidated under her name, and the interest had compounded in ways that meant the total now exceeded the value of every horse and weapon they possessed. She owned them, she explained, with the calm of someone reciting mathematical proofs. She owned the ground beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. She owned their futures and their children's futures, according to the laws that the white government would enforce with rifles and cannon if necessary. The drought, she noted, was merely nature's way of accelerating the inevitable. Within months, perhaps weeks, they would have no choice but to surrender to the cavalry or die of thirst in the desert that had once sustained them. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Taze, Inali's most loyal lieutenant, reached for his knife, his face contorted with rage at this violation of everything sacred. Other warriors moved to support him, their hands finding weapons, their bodies coiled for violence. But Inali raised his hand, and the gesture still carried enough authority to freeze them in place. He looked at Kaya with eyes that had seen too much death to fear it, but also with something approaching respect, the acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. He asked in a voice roughened by dust and grief what she wanted. Victory without mercy, he suggested, seemed unlike the traditions of her people. Kaya's response was delivered without triumph or malice, merely as a statement of terms. She wanted what she had always wanted, she said. She wanted the promise fulfilled. But the marriage she now proposed was not the romantic fantasy of an 18-year-old girl. It was a strategic alliance, a merger of her wealth and legal power with his knowledge of the land and authority over his people. She would fund the drilling of deep wells that could tap into aquifers beneath the reach of the drought. She would use her connections in Washington to broker a lasting peace with the cavalry. leveraging relationships with politicians and generals who owed her favors accumulated through years of careful cultivation. She would transform the dying remnant of his clan into something that could survive the changing world. The price, she repeated with emphasis, remained unchanged from 15 years ago. He would acknowledge her as his wife according to both Apache custom and American law. He would accept her authority in matters of external negotiation and resource management. He would, in essence, surrender the autonomy he had fought his entire life to preserve, not to an enemy's sword, but to the cold machinery of contracts and capital. It was a treaty of surrender disguised as a marriage proposal, and everyone present understood exactly what was being offered and what was being taken away. The negotiations stretched across 3 days, conducted in the relative cool of evening, when the worst of the heat had passed but the land still radiated warmth like a banked fire. Inali sat across from Kaya in his lodge, the space between them filled with the weight of 15 years and the ghost of a girl's declaration. The discussions were practical, stripped of sentiment, focused on the mechanics of survival. She presented blueprints for well systems purchased from engineers in Denver. She showed contracts with suppliers willing to extend credit against her collateral. She described in detail the political landscape in Washington, naming senators and bureaucrats, explaining the web of relationships that would need to be activated to secure the protection his people required. Inali listened with the attention of someone who had spent a lifetime parsing the nuances of negotiation, understanding that words could be as deadly as bullets when deployed with precision. He asked questions that revealed his intelligence had not been dulled by hardship. He probed for weaknesses in her proposals, testing for hidden costs or concealed obligations. He recognized that she had studied the situation with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign, accounting for variables he had not even considered. The realization was humbling, a confirmation that the world had changed in ways that made his kind of power increasingly irrelevant. Strength of arms meant nothing when the enemy could starve you through control of resources you could not even see. The internal resistance came to a head on the third night. Taze could no longer contain the fury that had been building since Kaya's arrival. He stood before the assembled warriors and elders, his voice shaking with emotion that transcended mere anger into something approaching religious fervor. He spoke of betrayal and desecration, of ancestors who would curse them for surrendering to a woman who had learned her power from the very people who sought to destroy them. He argued that death with honor was preferable to life as subjects of someone who had no respect for the old ways. He pointed at Kaya with a trembling finger, calling her a witch who had seduced their chief not with beauty, but with the dark magic of white man's law. The speech resonated with many present. The warriors who had fought beside Inali for decades felt the same visceral rejection of everything Kaya represented. The elders who remembered a time before the encroachment of settlements and railroads mourned the final death of a way of life they had known was ending, but had hoped to delay a little longer. The women who had lost husbands and sons to the cavalry's bullets saw in Kaya's expensive dress and perfect English a betrayal of the suffering that had defined their existence. The camp fractured along lines of desperation, with those willing to accept any path to survival on one side, and those who preferred to die as they had lived on the other. Kaya watched the division with the calm of someone who had anticipated this reaction and prepared for it. She did not argue or plead. She did not attempt to win them through appeals to emotion or tradition. Instead, she waited until the shouting had exhausted itself into bitter silence. And then she asked a single question. She asked if they remembered the massacre at White River, the event that had triggered the current cycle of violence with the cavalry, the atrocity that had cost them their finest warriors and begun the spiral of retaliation that had led to their current desperation. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through the assembled clan. Of course they remembered White River. It was burned into their collective memory, a wound that had never healed, the reason children grew up without fathers and wives slept alone. The cavalry had attacked without warning, they said. The soldiers had shown no mercy to women and children. It was the proof of the white man's inherent evil, the justification for every act of resistance and revenge. But Kaya shook her head with an expression that combined pity and cold certainty. That was not what happened, she said. That was the story they had been told, the narrative that had sustained their anger. The truth was different, and it was time they heard it. She had spent years in archives, she explained, reading military reports and civilian testimonies, cross-referencing accounts from multiple sources to reconstruct what had actually occurred. The massacre at White River had begun, not with cavalry aggression, but with an act of desecration committed by young warriors seeking to prove their courage. They had destroyed a mission church, slaughtering the priest and the families who had sheltered there. Not because of any strategic value, but because of youthful arrogance and the desire to make a statement. The cavalry's response, brutal and disproportionate as it was, had been retaliatory, not unprovoked. And the war chief who had led those young warriors, who had given the order to burn the church, who had lit the fuse that exploded into years of bloodshed, was sitting before them now. The revelation struck like lightning through the assembled clan. All eyes turned to Inali, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for any indication that the accusation was false. What they saw instead was the terrible stillness of a man confronting a truth he had buried so deep that he had almost convinced himself it was not real. His silence was confession enough. The warriors who had revered him, who had followed him through countless battles believing they fought for justice, felt the foundation of their loyalty crack and begin to crumble. The elders who had supported his leadership looked at him with eyes that held questions they had never thought to ask. Inali could have lied. He could have denounced Kaya as a liar spreading poison. He could have demanded proof and rallied his supporters against this threat to his authority. But something in him, some core of integrity that had survived all the compromises and necessities of leadership, would not allow the deception to continue. He spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, confirming what Kaya had revealed. He had been young, he said. He had been angry at the missionaries who told his people their gods were false and their ways were savage. He had wanted to send a message, to prove that the Apache would not be cowed by the white man's presence. He had not anticipated the scale of the cavalry's response. He had not understood that his single act of violence would cascade into years of suffering for everyone he led. The admission destroyed what remained of his unchallenged authority. Taze, who had been prepared to die defending his chief's honor, stood frozen in place, his knife hanging uselessly from his hand. The warriors who had followed Inali into battle after battle, believing they fought to avenge White River, now understood they had been killing and dying to protect their leader's pride. The women who had lost families to the violence looked at him with expressions that ranged from pity to cold fury. In the space of a few words, Kaya had accomplished what no cavalry assault could achieve. She had shattered the myth that held the clan together, exposing the human fallibility beneath the legend. The power vacuum was absolute, and Kaya filled it with the efficiency of water flowing into empty space. She did not gloat or triumph. She simply began making decisions, and the clan, rudderless and reeling from the revelation, accepted her leadership because the alternative was complete dissolution. She sent riders to neighboring clans, arranging meetings with chiefs who had maintained uneasy neutrality in the conflict with the cavalry. She drafted messages to the federal marshals, proposing ceasefire terms backed by her financial guarantees. She ordered the immediate beginning of well construction, bringing in crews of workers who arrived with equipment the Apache had never seen, massive drills that could pierce the earth to depths where water still flowed in darkness. Her negotiations with Chief Cochise of the Chiricahua were conducted with a respect that acknowledged his status without surrendering her own authority. She met him on neutral ground, bringing gifts that demonstrated wealth without appearing condescending. She spoke of mutual protection and shared resources, framing her proposals as alliances rather than charity. Cochise, a leader who had survived through adaptability as much as strength, recognized in Kaya something he had not seen in the white leaders who typically demanded his surrender. She was offering a path forward that preserved dignity while acknowledging reality, a balance he had thought impossible in the current age. The federal marshals proved more difficult. They arrived with suspicion hard-wired into their posture, expecting either a trap or a waste of their time. Colonel Blackwood accompanied them, his cavalry uniform bearing the dust of recent campaigns, his eyes holding the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting too long without clear purpose. Kaya met them in the great tent she had erected near the well sites, a space that combined Apache tradition with the formality of white negotiations. She presented her case with the precision of a lawyer arguing before a judge, citing treaties and precedents, explaining how continued conflict served no one's interests, while peace backed by economic development could transform the territory from a drain on federal resources into a productive region. She showed them surveys and financial projections. She named investors willing to fund irrigation projects and trading posts. She described a future where the Apache clans became integrated into the territorial economy, not as conquered subjects, but as participants with protected rights and defined territories. It was a vision that required all parties to surrender something: the government its demand for total submission, the cavalry its role as an occupying force, the Apache their complete autonomy. But it was a vision that offered everyone survival in a world where the old solutions had led only to escalating violence and diminishing returns. Blackwood listened with the skepticism of someone who had been lied to too many times. He asked pointed questions about enforcement and verification. He demanded to know what would happen when the next young warrior decided to raid a settlement, when the next settler decided to stake a claim in restricted territory. Kaya's response was delivered with the calm of someone who had anticipated every objection. She would personally guarantee the peace, she said, backing her promise with bonds that would be forfeited if violence resumed. She would establish a council of arbitration, composed of Apache elders, territorial judges, and military observers to resolve disputes before they escalated. She would create economic incentives for compliance, ensuring that peace was more profitable than war for all parties involved. The transformation she proposed was radical in scope and ambition. It required trust from people who had learned through bitter experience that trust was a luxury they could not afford. But the alternatives had become clear. The cavalry could continue killing Apache until the last warrior fell, but the cost in lives and resources would be staggering, and the resulting resentment would poison the territory for generations. The Apache could continue fighting until they were extinct, or forced onto reservations that were little better than prisons. Or they could accept Kaya's vision, this strange hybrid of traditional authority and modern economics, and see if survival was possible on terms that preserved some measure of dignity. The agreement was not reached in a single meeting. It required weeks of negotiations, with Kaya moving between the Apache camps and the cavalry headquarters, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, wearing down resistance through sheer persistence and logical argument. She faced opposition from hardliners on both sides who saw compromise as betrayal. She survived an assassination attempt by a settler who saw her as an Indian sympathizer. She endured whispered accusations from Apache women who viewed her as a traitor to her heritage. But she pressed forward with the relentless determination of someone who had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, who understood that this was the purpose toward which every sacrifice and humiliation had been directed. When the treaty was finally signed, it was witnessed by representatives from Washington, tribal leaders from 3 clans, military officers, and territorial judges. The document was complex, running to dozens of pages defining boundaries and rights and obligations in language that lawyers had labored over to ensure enforceability. But the essence was simple. The Apache clans would maintain control over defined territories with guaranteed water rights and hunting grounds. In exchange, they would cease all raids on settlements and submit disputes to arbitration. The government would withdraw military presence from Apache lands and provide infrastructure support for the wells and irrigation systems Kaya was funding. And Kaya herself, through the legal entity she had created, would serve as the guarantor and mediator, the bridge between worlds that had been at war for so long, they had almost forgotten what peace looked like. The wedding occurred on the same day the treaty was signed, a deliberate conflation that made the personal and political indistinguishable. It was conducted according to both Apache tradition and American law, a ceremony that satisfied the requirements of two incompatible systems through careful choreography. The Apache elders performed the ancient rituals, speaking blessings in a language that predated the arrival of horses on the continent. A territorial judge, brought at considerable expense from Santa Fe, pronounced them married under the laws of the United States and its territories. Kaya wore white, a concession to American custom. But the dress was decorated with traditional beadwork and patterns that told stories of survival and transformation. Inali wore his finest ceremonial attire, but the silver bands at his wrists were newly polished, gleaming in the afternoon sun like promises of renewal. The witnesses to the marriage were the same people who had witnessed the treaty signing, creating a seamless transition from one historic moment to the next. There was something surreal about the juxtaposition, the ancient ceremony of joining two lives performed in the shadow of legal documents that would reshape the entire territory's future. Kaya and Inali spoke the required words, their voices steady, their faces revealing nothing of the complex emotions that surely moved beneath the surface. This was not a love match in any conventional sense. It was a strategic alliance, a merger of power and necessity, a solution to problems that had seemed insoluble. Yet, there were moments during the ceremony that hinted at something beyond mere calculation. The way Inali's hand trembled slightly when he placed the ceremonial bracelet on Kaya's wrist, the brief softening in Kaya's expression when the elders blessed them with sacred smoke, the quality of silence that fell when they were pronounced married, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing not just a wedding, but the collision of two eras, the end of one story and the uncertain beginning of another. The past 15 years had led inexorably to this moment, every choice and sacrifice and humiliation culminating in these vows, spoken before witnesses who represented the full spectrum of the territory's complicated reality. The celebration that followed was muted, lacking the usual exuberance of Apache weddings. Too much had been lost. Too many ghosts haunted the gathering. Too much uncertainty clouded the future. But food was shared, tobacco was smoked, stories were told. The cavalry officers mingled awkwardly with Apache warriors, both sides struggling to navigate a peace that felt more fragile than the previous state of war. Children ran between the tents, their laughter a reminder that life continued despite history's weight. And throughout it all, Kaya moved with quiet confidence, speaking to chiefs and colonels with equal ease, ensuring that every faction felt acknowledged, that every concern was noted for future attention. Inali watched his new wife with an expression that defied easy interpretation. There was humiliation in it, certainly. The bitter knowledge that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as beneath notice. But there was also something approaching admiration, the warrior's respect for a superior strategist. She had defeated him more completely than any cavalry charge could have achieved, and she had done it using weapons he barely understood. Legal mechanisms and financial instruments that had proven more devastating than bullets. The girl who had declared she would marry him had become the woman who held his entire world in her hands, and the reversal was so complete, so absolute, that it achieved a kind of terrible grandeur. The revelation of the silver talon came late in the evening, when the ceremonial obligations had been fulfilled and the witnesses had dispersed to their respective camps. The tribal elders approached Kaya with expressions that combined reverence and caution, requesting to examine the locket she always wore. She removed it without hesitation, placing it in the trembling hands of the oldest elder, a woman whose age was impossible to determine, but whose memory stretched back to days when the Apache had ranged freely across territories that now bore American names. The elder studied the locket under lamplight, her fingers tracing patterns etched into the silver, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The silver talon, she explained to the gathered crowd, was not merely jewelry. It was a sacred token, created generations ago as a symbol of alliance between Kaya's maternal ancestors and the Chiricahua people. The story had been passed down through the women's line, almost forgotten in the chaos of recent decades, but the elders still remembered. A great drought had struck the land in those ancient days, much like the current crisis, and survival had required unprecedented cooperation between clans that had previously competed for resources. The alliance had been sealed with the creation of the Silver Talon, a promise that the bearers of the token would always find shelter and support among the Chiricahua, that the bond between peoples transcended individual conflicts. Kaya had carried this token her entire life without fully understanding its significance. Her mother had given it to her with vague instructions to keep it safe, to never lose it, but the full story had died with the older generation. Now, hearing the elders' words, she understood that her declaration 15 years ago had not been the whim of an arrogant girl, but the unconscious fulfillment of an ancient obligation. The locket had drawn her to Inali not through romantic attraction, but through the invisible threads of ancestral promises, duties that transcended individual will. She was not a conqueror or a manipulator. She was the manifestation of an old alliance coming back to life when it was needed most desperately. The revelation transformed the wedding from a marriage of convenience into something approaching sacred duty. The clan members who had viewed Kaya with suspicion or resentment began to see her through different eyes. She was not an outsider who had seized power through exploitation. She was the return of family long separated, the answer to prayers spoken by elders who had never stopped believing in the old stories. The women who had lost families to the violence approached her with offerings, small gifts that acknowledged her place among them. The warriors who had followed Taze's call for resistance lowered their eyes in shame, understanding that they had nearly rejected the very help their ancestors had arranged. Inali listened to the elders' explanation with an expression that moved through shock into something approaching awe. He had laughed at a sacred messenger. He had dismissed the fulfillment of an ancient promise as the fantasy of a foolish girl. The magnitude of his error was almost incomprehensible, a failure of recognition so complete that it revealed the limits of his wisdom. He had been so focused on his own authority, so consumed by the immediate struggles of leadership, that he had been blind to the deeper currents moving beneath the surface of events. The girl he had mocked had been more connected to his people's survival than he had ever understood, and the 15 years she had spent in the white world had been a necessary transformation, the preparation required for her to fulfill her ancestral role. The months following the wedding were a period of transformation so rapid and comprehensive that it felt almost supernatural. The deep wells Kaya had promised were completed on schedule, their pumps bringing water from aquifers so far below the surface that the drought could not touch them. The first surge of clear, cold water was greeted with tears and prayers, a gift that seemed miraculous after years of desperate rationing. The cottonwoods began to recover, their leaves returning in tentative clusters. Crops were planted in irrigated fields, experimental at first, but soon expanding as techniques were refined and confidence grew. The land that had seemed cursed began to show signs of healing, and with it came a cautious hope that survival might be possible after all. The railroad reached the valley in the autumn, its iron tracks gleaming like scars across the landscape. There had been fears that the railroad would bring destruction, that it would be the final nail in the coffin of Apache autonomy. But Kaya had prepared for this, as thoroughly as she had prepared for everything else. The legal fortress she had constructed around the Apache territories included provisions that diverted the main line around the most sacred lands, while allowing for a trading station at the valley's edge. The station became a hub of controlled interaction, a place where Apache craftspeople could sell their work directly to travelers, where merchants could trade for supplies under terms that protected both parties. The economic transformation was as significant as the physical one. The Apache clans, long sustained by hunting and raids, learned new skills that allowed them to participate in the territorial economy without sacrificing their identity. Some became guides for travelers seeking to understand the desert's secrets. Others specialized in raising horses, their traditional expertise translated into a commercial enterprise. The women's beadwork and weaving, once created for personal use or ceremony, became valuable trade goods that brought steady income. It was not the life their grandparents had known, but it was a life that offered dignity and autonomy, a middle path between extinction and total assimilation. Kaya and Inali's relationship evolved with the same gradual transformation that was reshaping the valley. The initial hostility and resentment softened into something more complex. A partnership built on mutual respect, if not passionate love. They worked together on the Council of Arbitration, resolving disputes between clan members and settlers, their combined perspectives allowing them to see solutions that neither could have found alone. Inali brought his knowledge of the land and his understanding of Apache custom. Kaya brought her legal expertise and her connections to the white power structure. Together, they created a system of governance that was imperfect but functional, a hybrid that borrowed from both worlds while being entirely captured by neither. In the quiet hours, when the day's work was done and they sat on the porch of the stone ranch house Kaya had built, they sometimes talked about the past. Inali spoke of his regret for the mockery, for the arrogance that had blinded him to what was standing before him 15 years ago. Kaya admitted that the girl who had made that declaration had no real understanding of what she was promising, that the woman she had become was someone the girl could not have imagined. They acknowledged that their marriage was strange, built on foundations that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival and strategic necessity. But they also recognized that it worked, that they had created something functional and potentially lasting, even if it did not conform to anyone's traditional expectations. The sunset over the valley painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, colors so vivid they seemed unreal, a benediction over land that had been through drought and war and emerged scarred but alive. The Gila River, fed by the new wells and a tentative return of seasonal rains, ran fuller than it had in a decade. The sounds of the camp drifted up to the house, children's laughter and the low murmur of conversations, the normal sounds of a community at peace. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and another answered, their voices echoing across the valley that had witnessed so much suffering and was now, finally, experiencing a fragile reprieve. Kaya looked at Inali, this man who had laughed at her promise and was now bound to her by law and sacred tradition, and felt something unexpected. It was not love in the sense that stories described it, not the overwhelming passion that swept away reason, but it was satisfaction, the deep contentment of having accomplished something that mattered, of having taken her anger and humiliation and transformed them into something constructive. She had promised she would return and claim him, and she had kept that promise in ways that the girl could never have anticipated. The victory was complete, but it was not the triumph of destruction. It was the triumph of transformation, of taking what seemed like inevitable tragedy and reshaping it into survival. Inali, for his part, looked at the woman who had defeated him so thoroughly and felt his perspective continuing to shift. The humiliation had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, a recognition that she had not merely conquered him, but had saved everything he had fought to protect. His pride had been broken, yes, but what had replaced it might prove more valuable in the long run. Humility, the understanding that his way was not the only way, that strength could take forms he had not previously recognized. She had taught him lessons he had been too arrogant to learn through gentler means, and those lessons had proven essential to his people's survival. The future stretched before them, uncertain as all futures are, but no longer dominated by the grinding desperation that had characterized recent years. The treaty would be tested. There would be violations and misunderstandings, moments when the fragile peace threatened to shatter. But the framework existed now, the mechanisms for resolution without resorting to immediate violence. The wells would continue to provide water even if the drought returned. The railroad would bring both opportunity and threat, requiring constant vigilance and negotiation. The children growing up in the valley would inhabit a world dramatically different from the one their parents had known, and it would be the responsibility of leaders like Kaya and Inali to ensure that difference represented progress rather than mere loss. The silver locket rested against Kaya's throat, its weight familiar and constant, a reminder of promises kept and destinies fulfilled. The man who had dismissed her as a foolish child now sat beside her as her husband, their partnership strange and strategic, and somehow right for the circumstances that had created it. The valley that had seemed destined for destruction had found a path forward, narrow and difficult, and requiring constant attention, but real nonetheless. And the girl who had stood in the dust 15 years ago, absorbing mockery with silent determination, had become the architect of survival for an entire people, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not through force, but through patience, preparation, and the willingness to transform oneself completely in pursuit of a goal that matters more than pride. The stars emerged in the darkening sky, countless points of light that had witnessed everything, the cycles of violence and peace, the rise and fall of peoples and cultures, the eternal struggle between those who would preserve the past and those who would embrace the future. Kaya and Inali sat in silence, two souls who had found an unexpected common ground beneath that vast western sky, watching the night settle over a valley that had been given, through sacrifice and strategy, and the fulfillment of ancient promises, the precious gift of another tomorrow. Enjoyed this journey? Tell us which corner of the world you're watching from. Leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next adventure we have in store.